Good afternoon, Homes Road Church of Christ. Hope you're having a great Wednesday in the Lord. Hope everything is going well. Hope to see you soon. It's October. Can you believe it? Time just keeps flying along, but October is such a great month. I mean, it's a month of cooler temperatures after a long, hot summer. There's football in full swing. The leaves are changing colors. Everything's getting beautiful. There's a lot of fun. There's corn mazes and haunted houses and apple cider and all kinds of great things. There's scary nighttime hay rides. There's all kinds of fun things to do come the Halloween time. Even Halloween's a fun holiday. I know some people really enjoy that. One of the earliest memories that I have as a child growing up in New Mexico in the elementary schools was every Halloween time, every October came around, in elementary school, we would watch the famous Washington Irving story about the legend of Sleepy Hollow. And it was such a fun little story when I was a kid. We used to watch that cartoon every single year in school. The story from Washington Irving was about Ichabod Crane. Everyone remembers Ichabod Crane, the school teacher who sought to marry this beautiful young woman named Katrina. But what you remember most about the story, it was the Headless Horseman, especially as a kid. That image of the Headless Horseman just in my brain. But the Headless Horseman was this scary apparition, this scary ghost that ran around the countryside haunting people. And one night, Ichabod encounters this ghostly apparition on the horseback, and he flees and runs away from the region in terror. But it's clear to all the readers of the story, the people watching, that this is no apparition, this is no ghost. The horseman was actually just a rival man who wanted Katrina for himself and effectively used the horseman legend to chase off Ichabod and marry her for himself. That Ichabod is probably the most well-known person in today's society. No one is named Ichabod today, but if you say the word Ichabod, people think of the legend of Sleepy Hollow. But what most people don't realize is that Ichabod is a name that actually is first mentioned in the Bible. The biblical Ichabod has also a very gloomy backstory about him. And Washington Irving, who wrote the legend of Sleepy Hollow, got inspiration from the gloomy story of the biblical Ichabod. So let me just tell you about the biblical Ichabod and maybe some of the lessons that we can learn from him. In the Bible, Ichabod was given a very terrible name. I'll tell you about what the name is here in a few seconds. But this man in the Bible, he only shows up in a handful of verses. That's why he's not super known. We don't study him necessarily on our Sunday morning schools when we grew up. But back in the ancient days of Israel, when they escaped slavery in Egypt, God established a priesthood in the tribe of Levi. But over the years, this priesthood got real weak morally. It got corrupted, and especially by the time Ichabod steps into the picture in the Bible. You are most likely familiar with the story of the prophet Samuel and the priest named Eli who raised him. Samuel was dedicated to the temple service at a very young age. His mom went to the temple and gave custody over to Eli. And Samuel lived with Eli, was raised by Eli, and lived with that high priest and his family. But Eli had some very sinful, evil, and wicked sons. And one of them was named Phinehas. And Phinehas married an unnamed woman who gives birth to a son, Ichabod. And you can find all this in 1 Samuel chapter 4. But now the meaning of the name Ichabod sheds light on the hopelessness of Israel's situation at the time. Israel had been engaging in a battle with their enemies, the Philistines. The Philistines had been their enemy for a very long time, and Phinehas and his wicked brother decided to turn the tide of the battle. They said they'd had enough. They wanted to do something to finish off the Philistines forever and get rid of this enemy. So they bring out the Ark of the Covenant. In this battle strategy, they didn't consult God about it. That's not what God wanted. It wasn't his purpose or his will. And so naturally, it fails and fails miserably. And the Philistines completely destroy the Israelites. And while all that is going on, Ichabod's mother is dying. She's dying during childbirth. She's giving birth to Ichabod, and she's dying in the process. But she births her son. And Eli's son dies. Eli's son, both of them, Phinehas and the brother, both die in battle. Eli dies when he falls from a roof. And the Philistines, they steal the Ark of the Covenant away from Israel and take it into their own land. And upon hearing the news of all the disasters that had befallen on her family and all of the nation of Israel, the woman, the mother of Ichabod, as she's giving birth, she's dying. And she hears about all the disasters that have happened, that Phinehas and her brother and Eli and all of them have gotten killed. And when she hears about all of this, she decides to name her son Ichabod, which means no glory. If you put it in a question, it means, where is the glory? In other words, the dying words of this woman, the name that she gives her son, is saying the glory of the Lord has left her household, has left the nation of Israel. The Philistines have captured the ark, and there's nothing left because God is gone. There's no more blessings. And eventually it is returned to Israel, but for years they experienced devastation without the glory of God, or the lack of the presence of the ark being in their nation. Throughout Israel's history, they witnessed the Lord's glory depart, most often ending in tragedy. And for instance, Ezekiel 10, God's glory disappears from the temple because of Israel's sin. Now, there are three truths that we can learn from this very sad tale of the biblical Ichabod. There's three lessons we can learn from the biblical Ichabod. First, like many of the kings, Ichabod hailed from a family of chaos. Not only did Eli's son commit heinous acts and disregarded God's guidances or guidelines for Levitical priests, but Eli passively allowed for them to continue in their actions. This ultimately led to the downfall of all three of these men on the same day. Nevertheless, even though Ichabod didn't come from a good family, as you can see from the example of the kings of Judah, God can still move in the lives of broken people. Your roots don't have to determine who you are. And that's what we see from Ichabod. He carried on the priesthood. He stayed in the priesthood even though he got all of that history. He continued the line of the priesthood. Secondly, the second lesson we can learn from Ichabod is not to allow your name or your family to determine your legacy. Even with all that gloominess in his name and in his story, he didn't give up hope. Names had a real deep meaning in the Bible. They determined someone's actions, their life legacy. Ichabod, upon receiving such a horrid name at his mother's dying breath, could have allowed the definition of no glory to rule his life. Instead, he continued the priesthood in the hope that God's glory would come back to Israel. And the last lesson we can learn from the biblical Ichabod is that the ark did eventually return to Israel. God's glory does not depart. He constantly returns to Israel time and time and time again. That was the cycle of Israel. They would sin, they would forget about God, God would leave, but then they'd repent and God would come back. He always returned to Israel, no matter how many times they messed up. Even when the enemy would steal the presence of God, just like the Philistines took the ark away, we can still rest in the fact that we know that God will handle everything and can turn everything right in the end, and that he will return to us when we are repentant. So that is the story of the biblical Ichabod. As we get into this time of Halloween and people start thinking about the legend of Sleepy Hollow once again, just know Ichabod was biblical long before Washington Irving created his story. I hope these lessons were a good reminder for you, and we'll see you soon, Holmes Road. Bye-bye.